Well, I think we've got a good crowd, particularly for crack of AA dawn. So that's I think we'll kick off with a bit of an introduction and launch into our first session. But and I think we've invited some students who have applied to the AA as part of today. So I'll welcome everyone. My name is Mark Morris. I'm head of teaching and learning at the Architectural Association. And this is our term 2 winter open jury. Normally, after a week of carousing around the planet on wondrous unit and program field trips, it's useful to access the sobering effect of a good all-day critique. But this year, as a culmination of a more sedate open week, I would invite you to instead drink the intoxicating elixir of themes, projects, and guest critics we have on offer today, and celebrate Friday. Anyone who can make it through the whole of the presentations today can receive a luncheon voucher for the AA restaurant redeemable by 2024. I should remind everyone that today we're halfway through the academic year and we're looking at work in process, and that's the glory of it, really. It's a formative and constructive kind of critique. And I think it's actually where all the magic is, and smack dab in the middle of term 2. A parent at a recent open day asked me why we teach architecture by way of criticism. And I explained it isn't the sort of criticism she might be thinking of. I mean, we have critics that address a project's shortcomings and challenges. We recommend references and ways forward to progress work. Their response to this was, it still sounds like criticism to me, which I suppose it is, but architects really love criticism. I'm reminded of a time a friend of mine, a colleague, got sunburnt in vacationing in the Orkney Islands in northern Scotland. And he was, when I visited him, dressed from head to toe in bandages, but with one eye open like a mummy. And my first response as an architect was to say, I don't like the look of that eye. So criticism is how we thrive. And I think today we'll progress work in the way we normally do, through lots of criticism and discussion. There are numerous projects submitted for this particular open week. So Manager, who has beautifully organized today, let in as many projects as possible. So we'll be looking within each session at 4 projects, some of them presented by groups of students. So you'll see a lot going on today, but we'll cover a dozen across our 3 sessions. Importantly, and I think this is fantastic, we have projects from foundation, first year, experimental diploma, and postgraduate on offer. So we'll see the whole panoply of the provision as we make our way through the day. I'd like to also thank, as I mentioned, Manager for bringing this together, Thomas Parks for his support, and Liam Green for assistance throughout. We really appreciate their time today. Our review schedule, I will go over in just a bit, but there are 3 sessions, as I said, 3 themes today. Kate Davies, leading Communication and Media Studies, will have her session organized around the theme of sight, and her jurors will be introduced at the start of their session. We're thrilled to have them. Following a break, Ignacio Marti from Environmental Technology Studies will chair a session on making and have a set of jurors and fresh horses for that session. And then finally, after another break, I will come back for a session around the theme of collaboration and a summary discussion at the end of the day. Because we have 4 projects per session, that really means we have 20 minutes per project. Students have been asked to present maximum 5 minutes, leaving 15 minutes for discussion. We would ask that we'd love to take questions from the audience. What we'll try to do is at the end of each session, there's a moment for a larger discussion. And through the chat mechanism on this platform, it would be fantastic if people would raise their questions through the chat, and we'll be able to address and I think have a great conversation today. I wanted to thank all of the jurors for coming today, and to really thank the students for putting themselves forward, putting their work forward, and engaging in this level of discourse. It's always, I think, a fantastic way to mark the midpoint of the year and to celebrate what we do. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Kate Davies to introduce her jurors and set up the first session today. Just to give you a sense of timing throughout, we'll, I think, be able to have the first session conclude by way of 12:30. That's a lunch break. And then the afternoon session will kick off with Nacho's session, 1:30, concluding around 3:30. My session, collaboration, kicking off at 4 o'clock, get a cup of tea, come to collaboration, and we'll conclude around about 5:30, and that'll be the full day. So looking forward to seeing lots of great work and having some amazing discussion with you all. Kate, over to you.
Hi, you can hear me okay, hopefully. Hello, everybody. Hello, everyone in Zoom land out there. So our session's going to be themed around sight. We have no idea what the projects are, which is exciting, I think. So as Mark's already introduced, we're going to have a 5-minute presentation by the students and around 15-minute discussion from the panel. And just to introduce our panel for today, who are all absolutely fantastic. I'm so excited to be able to have a conversation with them. We've got, and maybe you could give it, I know it's a bit cheesy, but you could give a wave so that people can find you when I introduce you. But to start, we've got Tanya Kovacs. There she is. Tanya's down in Devon. She's an artist exploring our experience of landscape loosely, and a real advocate of drawing. She's professor of drawing and making at the University of Dundee and works through sculptural works and drawing and writing. And really her kind of a focus and obsession and a passion for the landscape is why I've invited her here today, and I'm very excited to have a conversation about the work with her. We also have Perry Culpa. Perry, it's 5 a.m. I believe over there. So bonus points for getting up really early. Perry Culpa is an architect and associate professor of architecture at the University of Michigan. And part of his interest is about the roles and potential of architectural drawing. And if you've ever seen any of his drawings, amazing, fantastic drawings, you'll understand that really is a passion. And I think I'm interested, among other things, to have him here as an advocate of drawing as a site of representation, or the sites of representation open to architects, as well as the sites of operation. And then we have also Jussi Parikka, who is in Finland, professor of technological culture and aesthetics at Winchester School of Art at Southampton, also visiting professor at the Academy of Performing Arts in Prague, where he leads the project on operational images and visual culture. And he also teaches on the terraforming program at Strelka in Moscow. And I think that the kind of reason for being really excited to have Jussi here is the kind of convoluted media sites, the kind of places where technology interweaves through physical realms and messes the notion of sight up and kind of complicates it. So I think that is a very short introduction to people with very long and amazing bios. And I think we've got Anna to start, is that right? Anna Glick from Diploma 13.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi, do you want to take it away? So we're going to do about 5 minutes. If you run, I mean, give or take, if you're running terribly over, I'll give you a nudge. If that sounds okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. I also have to turn off my camera so that it doesn't lag. Wait, I don't see my... Okay, I can turn it off, so. Okay, so in my project, I'm looking into the construction of the narrative as a way of nation building within the context of Russian history. In 2018, a Belarusian film director, Sergei Loznitsa, made a film which consisted only of the archival footage that he had found in the state archive. The footage contained a 30-day trial of a group of engineers that had created an undercover organization called Industrial Party that was planning an intervention together with the French government. The trial happened in Moscow in 1930 and was filmed. The engineers were sent to prison, some were shot. The case had no evidence supporting the accusation apart from the confession. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was confirmed that the Industrial Party did not exist. The case was fabricated. So the focus shifts from construction of a criminal case to construction of a historical narrative. The Big Soviet Encyclopedia was a singular source of universal knowledge that was published from 1926 until 1990. And the editions were published chronologically in alphabetical order. The issue with terms on letter B came out in 1950 and contained an article on Lavrenti Beria, Stalin's right hand. The article was idolizing and praising the service of Beria in Soviet Union, but after Stalin's death in 1953, all owners of that issue received a letter from the publishing house stating that they need to remove pages 23 and 24 with Beria's portrait, with a scalpel, and substitute with a rewritten article that would come by post. So now we move from 1953 to 2019, from the communist USSR to Democratic Russian Federation, and shifting focus from construction of historical narrative to construction of evidence. In 2019, Ivan Gulinov, an investigation journalist writing about corruption systems in Russia, was arrested for illegal drug making and trafficking, which is Article 228.1 in the Russian Criminal Code. Every year, the police goes through more than 100,000 drug-related cases, and every fourth prisoner is coming from the Article 228. Throughout the time, 228 became a national article due to its frequency. Ivan was detained in the center of Moscow. The police had found around 4 grams of methadone in the backpack and 3 bags of cocaine weighing more than 5 grams during the apartment search. The search procedure has a very strict protocol that has to be followed. It is essential to have a search warrant and at least 2 witnesses that are informed of the whole process before entering the site. The officers have to inform the suspects of their rights and the whole search procedure. Everyone has to be in the same room in order to observe the actions of the police officers. Any ejected objects have to be photographed and put into a protocol, which has to be signed by all participants at the end of the search. The search of Ivan's apartment was photographed by the police and released officially together as part of the evidence report. Police stated that they have looked through all the shelves and enclosed spaces. The photographs were always cropped and never shown the whole space, but the state at which the apartment was left after the search suggested that the search was staged. The police got the keys to the apartment half an hour before the official search had started. The majority of the storage units' shelves remained untouched. When releasing the evidence report from the search, it included photographs of the drug laboratory with the equipment and material needed for production of large batches. This counts as a serious crime and results in 10 to 20 years in prison. The police later confessed that only 1 photograph from the 9 published was taken at the apartment. The other 8, including all photos of the lab, were taken from a different case. The report was deleted. The case was soon closed due to lack of evidence. So visual evidence is supposedly a representation of truth, but how do we know whether this truth is objective or not? In the Allegory of the Cave, Plato talks about the nature of belief versus knowledge. In the Allegory, prisoners are chained together in a cave and see shadows casted by the fire, believing them to be real. Plato proposes that one prisoner realizes that the shadows are fake, leaves the cave, and discovers a whole new world outside that he was previously unaware of. But in our case, the object itself doesn't have a value, and it's not about which object is being held, but how it is being held, represented, or mediatized. Once the object gets documented, framed, and released as evidence, this is when the object becomes legitimized. But looking at the case studies, it is impossible not to notice theatrics behind them. The case studies become an analogy to a theater play. Every theater has a prop room where the objects that they use as part of the objects that they use as part of the set design to make a scene more believable for the audience. The state has its own prop room where the props are used as a middle ground between the nation and the state. The closet is used both for the storage and utilization of props, but most importantly for mediatization of them, transforming them from being simply an object sitting in the prop room into becoming the evidence, giving them a new role within the narrative. The state doesn't interact with the nation directly, but operates through different apparatuses that interact with individual, group, and public opinion, transforming opinion into truth. In order to become a better storyteller, the state had to mold the new narrative into the audience's favorable medium. Therefore, the prop room has to be a highly adaptable space with multiple inner departments where the props are mediatized in different ways. So, a photo studio for construction of visual evidence, a confession room to record audio material, a computer lab, a cinema room to watch the fabricated footage, a space for manipulation of documents and other printed material, an inner archive, and the court. Once the narrative is constructed, the play is ready to be performed to the audience. Hannah Arendt talks about politics and lies, where she indicates two types of lies that the state uses to create the new truth, or so to speak, post-truth: traditional lie and modern lie. Traditional lie is essentially concealment of facts, censorship. Modern lie is the manipulation of facts to create a specific narrative, which means that the truth itself is composed of different layers. In theater, it is represented by an addition or subtraction of props that are used in a specific scene. So what you see on stage becomes a representation of the visual evidence. The construction of a narrative is the apparatus of nation building that is putting a lot of pressure on the relationship between nature of belief and knowledge. The gesture of seeing and the gesture of believing, the gesture of searching and the gesture of knowing are being constantly tweaked to an extent when we cannot differentiate one from another. The state will always find ways to construct a narrative, to erase knowledge, to rewrite histories and present them in a favorable medium. But it is the audience who decides if the narrative succeeds or fails. Throughout the time, the audience becomes more picky. In the contemporary case study, the fabricated photographic evidence was used to legitimize the accusation, but it didn't work because the audience didn't believe it. The audience began to question what they had seen and came to a conclusion that the play was a failure. So to believe or not to believe, that's the question. But how do we decide what is true or what is not when the validity of a photograph or a video as a source of truth is destroyed? How do we decide if a story is real when the state as a source of truth is destroyed too? How does the audience construct its own body of knowledge? And how do we know what we know? Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I think I just want to start before I open the floor to the critics. Do you want to maybe summarize where you think your proposal's going, or what you can frame those in questions, or the things you don't know about what you're doing as well? That's always quite useful.
Yeah,
or what you want to ask us about your project.
I'm just trying to stop sharing the screen. Did I? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So essentially where I see my project going is basically I've been looking at the ways that the state was constructing narratives, and also the protocols that the police officers and departments have to follow in order for the whole procedure to be legitimized. So like both of them, they kind of counteract each other. And what I'm trying to propose eventually is a set of tools or a system that would stand as a third party between the state and the nation when it comes to, for example, criminal cases.
Okay, thanks. I think that's helpful. I'll throw it open to our three critics. And do you want to use the blue hands or throw up a real hand if you prefer? Or just butt in. Tanya.
Just to say, I've never been to one of these events before, but I really enjoyed the performative nature of your presentation. And I know you referred to the theatre and the staging, but actually your choreography of that presentation was really extraordinary. And just to my mind, it felt like that was what was going to build. If there was a build here, it was actually to look at how it brings to audience. I mean, I come from a different world to an architecture world, but it just seemed a very performative line of inquiry, where actually I thought that, you know, it might be you collaborate with performers to kind of enact your thesis or enact your insight to audience in the way that you just did, and that actually you know, that's the build. It's something much more collaborative and much more about, well, how do you bring this thinking to audience, rather than necessarily to architecture. Yeah, that's just a very kind of initial response, but I thought that was really impressive. And yeah.
Beauty.
Hi, Anya.
Hi.
Thanks very much for this. I am sitting actually quite close to Russian border at the moment, and I'm being reminded of this because there's always this road signs saying that St. Petersburg that way. So and as a Finn, I kind of got and also as a trained historian, I was trained originally as a historian, so I kind of I really like the ways in which you, and already as Tanya said, that way you perform the case, right? But also like how you build the idea that if we, especially because we're in a session about sight, that a site is where, but the site is also when. And the sort of a like historical strata that you want to build into this case is really interesting. And I might want to ask you about that, to clarify a bit about that. Just first as an observation, first I was thinking that you're going to be talking about the sort of a narratives of nation branding as such, as a production of a sense of a nation. Then you talked, and then I sort of thought that, okay, actually this is about narratives of legitimation for sort of a certain domestic understanding of, for instance, law, right? But then actually I realized that perhaps the two really go together in your presentation, which is, or your case as well, which is interesting. There's some other kind of things that I might want to return to as well, but perhaps I pose it as a question. We might sort of have an inkling of an answer already, but can you talk a bit more about the historical layers that on the one hand seem to be obvious about show trials, right? And the fabrication of a space of truth and fabrication perhaps of law, right? But how do they play these sort of a couple of moments that you build into your narrative as well that led into contemporary moment as well? How do you, the 30s, 50s, and then 2019? Can you speak a bit more about that and what it plays in your work?
Yeah, of course. It was important for me to look back and to see all the different ways that no matter what regime was installed, how was the case fabricated and what different tools were used and what was required for something to be believed. And when talking about the 1930 trials, what struck me is that then this footage that was a 3-hour long footage was made into a propaganda film, but also then it was put into the state archive where it was just sitting together next to all the material that was confirming that it was a fabrication. And it was only found in 2018, and it got a prize in, I think, Biennale or something. So it's like this fabrication that kind of goes back in time, but also comes back today and comes as a surprise, but also not really surprise, because essentially things do not really change that much. It's just the ways that are used in order to construct a narrative or tweak a narrative, they changed because our kind of belief systems, they change too throughout the time, because we have more of a visual culture right now, and we have so much information that comes from different sources, and often the sources which are from the state and the independent sources, they kind of go face to face and go against each other. So it's really up to one to decide which information you believe or not. But also today, when everything is supplied by the state, the investigators, the court decisions, and the evidence, and when it's the amount of percentage of the nation that actually trusts the state as the source of truth is being lowered every year, every month, it is important to understand that in order to understand whether something is real or not, it's essential to do investigation of the investigation. So go backwards and look into the information and look step by step. But in a lot of cases, it's easier to get it done when something already happened, when you have information in front of you from everywhere, be it a CCTV camera or a news article or a tweet or a sentence by the state. And then you put it all together as a picture and see what is real, what is not, what happens and what not happens. But yeah, I don't know.
Because you said something super interesting, and I won't take all of the time at all, but I want to pick up on that. Because when you say picture, it really gets interesting on multiple levels as well, because there's just not one kind of a picture, but I guess there's something about specifying, and this might be quite an open question, but specifying what sort of a instruments of truth, i.e. what sort of a pictures, what sort of a things you basically showed us as well, but there might be ways of specifying it as well. On the one hand, you got some film footage from 1930s as well. Then there's something about that sort of circuit of particular specification of what do we mean by an image in relation to truth, besides going back to Plato, and especially when we're dealing with technical images, and not only technical images. How does that circuit in relation to what are legal standards and what you said about protocols? And how does the sort of institutional status of an image sort of, how can it be teased out a bit more in specificity, perhaps? Mm-hmm. This is quite an open question of note, but still I wanted to pick up on that.
Yeah, but also I think that it's interesting to see at which point something becomes a piece of evidence. This is something that I'm also still trying to
Absolutely.
Harry.
Thank you, Anya, very much. It's super provocative. There are a handful of quick things I would mention. One, I think there's a real difference between narrative constructions and evidentiary fragments. So for me, evidence has lots of plausible outcomes where narratives normally have a common shared construction. So I would try to think about particularly in a legal ramifications, evidence look for truth, but evidence is often allows multiple stories to be constructed. So that's quite an interesting area for me in terms of your thesis for the work. Then I would say I would really try to be careful about audience constructions and which audiences are you actually going to try to speak to. In other words, if you're trying to make a political construction and reveal certain authorities in the background, then maybe you emphasize the diagrammatic construction of your story so that it exceeds the immediacy, let's say, of the specificity of what you're looking at. That has perhaps political ramifications. The specificities of a particular case and a spatial setup is a very, very different sort of scope. It speaks to people in different ways. So I would identify, who are the audiences, publics, legal authorities, the government, and so on, because you might make different decisions about different audience constructions. I was thinking also about the spatial sequence would become important to me, like how you get to the spatial sequence, your work, what's the setup or the prelude to the work, because I think that cautions or begins to render what's plausible then within the spatial setup and all the spatial conditions which you want to eventually reveal. I was also thinking about just representational techniques, and there are many, many things to talk about, so I don't want to take too much room, but the difference between perspectival constructions and, let's say, Chinese scroll paintings, where there's a revealment of the entirety of the setup of the evidence and the spatial field and so on, is quite different than a perspectival construction, which is different than a plan or axonometrics and so on. And I wondered if the biases or the preferences of representational logics would also allow you to unravel your story in a particular way or ways. In other words, digital modeling normally leads to perspectival constructions and spatial sequences. But in terms of evidence, there might be other modes by which you would put the evidence in the different room spaces and so on into play. And it might be worth really thinking about that as a mechanism. The representational structure would be a mechanism for revealing certain politics, ethics, and so on, because they're so heavily loaded. And I wonder if you could use the representational trope as a kind of an ally a parallel, a sort of parallax to help construct the larger story that you have in mind.
Yeah, I think that really amazing points being made. I agree. I think that there seems to me the site of the performance, as Tanya puts it, the presentation, the evidence you present, is the site where the project is enacted, right? And so I think what I wanted to ask you is because quite a lot of what you've presented so far is an analysis of a historical event, right? Where it's a kind of unpacking of something. Do you see the project proposing something where you propose a future event that takes place within kind of the potential of evidence in even kind of near future technologies like deep fake and those kinds of things? Where do you see the project going in that sense?
So what I was presenting is more of an ongoing research that helps me to understand how a proposition can be made, because there are a lot of different angles that you have to look into in order to propose something that would actually not be too naive. But I was not thinking of a future event, but like event as something performative or theatrical as an event, but maybe a set of tools, technological tools that would fit within the event, or a manual that could be used in order to kind of tweak the system in a way that would not allow the fabrications as easily as they can be allowed today. Because in a lot of cases, everything narrows down to a human factor where you kind of, for example, if you're a police officer, you have certain specific duties to inform, sorry, is it lagging or not? No. You have specific duties to inform the suspect of their rights and of the whole procedures, but in a lot of cases, because it's not really, nothing is really controlled, so this power dynamic is not controlled, and I'm trying to find a way, make a system or a set of tools that would be able to set a control frame for the system.
So kind of, okay, so kind of to mitigate it being used for underhand purposes. Is that what you mean? I mean, I think that's interesting. I think you could also think, well, how could you use the same tools for your own kind of agenda, if you see what I mean, or for a different type of agenda? Could you use the similar tools as a way that actually erodes the belief in the use of those tools in future, if that makes sense? Mm-hmm. And who's the, my last question is an open question, you don't have to answer, is, who's the protagonist and the propagator of this fiction in your project, and who is the audience? I think those seem to be really key questions. Yeah. I think we've got a couple more minutes if any of the panel want to make any final. Jussi.
I mean, we could talk about this for a long time because it's so fascinating on so many levels. I was also thinking about states are all the time, and we know that in Britain, but also in many other countries, constantly on the verge of, falling apart. So there's multiple ways of how different techniques make them stick together. This was the thing that Benedict Anderson was talking about as imagined communities, which is slightly different level, but there's something about this sort of a glue about truth. I'm thinking, could this also be a manual of, this is how you do a very good show trial? Is this a manual towards faking it? Not about truth, but also just basically how to lie. And that would sort of become a slightly different, but completely interlinked epistemological question as well. How to spatially, or in these terms that you presented, how to lie convincingly on a level that is of state or law.
Because it's almost like, to take your theatrical analogy and what Perry was saying, perhaps about the diagrammatic, you've got front of house, of this project. You've got what you're presenting as the narrative, what you're constructing as evidence, and then you've got the back of house. And I think within the presentation of your project, you have the potential to move in a quite sophisticated way between the two. And where you decide to reveal the mechanisms, you know, the wizard, I think is the key to the presentation of the project in a way.
Just to add quickly, I made a note about the means of delivery, Anya, that you would have at your disposal. And Kate and Yossi have touched on this. I would probably just take a moment and really think about the ways you could deliver the work. In other words, telling the story over a dinner party would be different than an operating manual, which would be different than taking your tools to another story and operating on that story. So I would just look at the different, and a spatial construction is a totally different way. It doesn't have to be one or the other, but I would look at the different means by which I could deliver the work. And I don't mean turn up at the year-end exhibition with, these are the kinds of drawings I'm going to make, but conceptually, you've got different means by which you can touch audiences with respect to what you want them to hear. And I would just sit, I just sit with my yellow pad and say, these are the options that I have. I'm going to look at Alphonse Bertillon, the great French police. Do you know Bertillon?
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I'm gonna parallel his life and make a narrative which uses Bertillon as a protagonist. So it would be helpful maybe just to, these are the means of delivery without making judgments at my disposal. And then if you just went in and sort of annotated those to see what those different means can deliver with respect to the messages you're trying, it might help to sharpen the, not sharpen, you don't need sharpening, help negotiate the next months in the work.
And I'm left with an absolute kind of thirst for a real thing that I can trust within your narrative. Like, I really want to handle the book, the encyclopedia, and see if people have, and see a cutout page or some, you know, your project leaves me with, you know, such insecurity about the nature of truth and evidence and how we evidence truth, and that I want to be reassured by a thing, an actual object that exists in the world, and so that or be in the building that the court took place in, or, you know, something that is, I mean, this is also to do with my digital reality, on our collective digital reality, but somehow I don't know where and how you'll be presenting this ultimately, but it's almost like if there was something in there that was real, I think that would be a really interesting challenge to everything else that you had put forward. So the encyclopedia or some of the actual fabricated evidence. Again, these could be fabricated objects as well, but it's just interesting how that might kind of change your relationship with some of the other imagery and things that you're talking about in narrative.
Absolutely. I think that's a lovely place to maybe put a full stop. Unless there's anything, I always like to leave the last word to the student. Is there anything, are there any questions you want to ask of your critics particularly?
I want to say thank you to everyone, because all the points were very, very valid and important, and they kind of, the questions that rose in my head during the comments, it kind of set the new parameters and the new routes, which I haven't really thought before. So I really want to thank you all.
Oh, thank you, Anya. Okay,
Great.
so yeah, we'll do a little digital.
Yes, well done. Thank you.
Oh, I can't hear you, Kate.
Sorry, I'm muted. That's the phrase of the year, isn't it? Emma's in foundation. Yes, so take it away, Emma. If you want to present for about 5 minutes, and then we'll have a chat about the work.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to share with you an experimental film which I made and is set in probably one of my favorite places on the earth, which is my dad's garden, a suburban garden. So it's a very small site. But so it's a short film poem came out of a brief to make a film about something that was personal to us. And I really wanted to figure out a way how to bridge the distance between me being here in my flat in London, my dad being by himself in Sussex, his garden in a place that I know really well and that we've spent a lot of time together. So how could we kind of be together in the same place without really being together? How could I describe the feeling of being in that place, and my relationship to it and him, and how it changes over time? So it's a film as much, I think, about the landscape as it is a portrait of the creatures that live there. One of them is human, and the others you'll find out in the film. It was a real collaborative process. It was a lot of back and forth, which was really enjoyable. So it was made, obviously, given a situation where I couldn't go there. So I used a lot of archival material, mainly photos that I already had, videos that he had, and new ones that I kind of directed him to make, audio recordings, voice recordings, music, and some stop motion. Yes, and also, yeah, so I'm interested in how you think I could develop the work, particularly as things progress, and maybe once I'm able to go there, how the two things can come together, and what you think about the relationship between film and architecture. So, yeah.
You think, oh, was it ever like that? Well, it looks like a different world in the summer, doesn't it?
It really does.
And the foxes about, and there's the sweet peas. Because we're sort of at the depth of the bleakness at the moment. We're sort of wintry bleakness.
He's a real man with a real story.
He's a real fella.
And it's all kind of set in his life of suburban, wherever it was that he lived.
Emma, do you want to say a bit more, or give us the director's cut? Or the director's commentary, sorry.
So it kind of started off as thinking about the audio first. So over the pandemic, I've been on the phone a lot with my dad. I'm blinded here by the light. And so I was using some voice recordings and trying to figure out what it was that we were speaking about a lot, and it was the garden, and how to kind of bring that together. So I was using recordings that I had made from having my phone on speakerphone, which surprised my dad when he saw the video, because he said, "How did you get my voice in the video?" And then I realized that I already had a lot of materials that I could draw on to create this sense of place, even though I'm not there at the moment. So I definitely felt kind of closer to it. I sent him a Bluetooth speaker, a camera attachment for the tripod to set up, asked him to do certain things, acting, not so great, because he kept looking at the camera, so I couldn't use some of that footage. But it was a really enjoyable experience, and yeah, kind of trying to get a sense of the place, I suppose, which to me is very familiar, but maybe, I mean, yeah, it's very personal. It's like sharing something very personal. So yeah.
I think it definitely, it really put a smile on my face. I just wanted to say that because I think there's something really beautiful about that film. And it did come across as very personal in a very generous way from you, which I think is not, you know, is not always the case with student work. Sometimes we always hold a bit back. And I think that that was really lovely to see. I'll open it up to our three incredible critics.
Yeah, I'll chip in. There was just so much love in that. It was lovely. You know, most of the people I know have really screwy relationships with their dad, me included. So yeah, it made me just want to watch it again and have a little cry. Might do that later. Yeah, no, I thought there was a beautiful atmosphere of memory and connection, and a kind of over the top of that, a new set of memories being made with the making of the film as well. There's a sort of, and a new connection. You're not talking about a past, it's also about negotiating this period of time, and just, you know, involving your dad as a co-creator in this somehow. Yeah, that's making a whole new memory with him. Like, oh, where that film we made in lockdown about all that other time and lovely memory in that garden, it's got a new memory, and I really like that about it. That it wasn't just memory, it was generating a new memory. And I know lockdown is hard to generate new memories, or at the moment things feel a little bit static. So that was very good. I just a little thing, I really didn't get the feather thing at the end. That seemed really, I couldn't attach that to anything. Like, the drawings are really lovely, the archival footage, the new footage, the presence of the fox, all the love in it. And then the feathers seem really decorative. Just like, oh, what's that then? Is that just a way to end it? And I, you know, there was so much beautiful kind of sound qualities and visual qualities and dream qualities, and I was just like, oh, what was that doing there? So just as a, you know, just as a, I suppose it did end it, but I wasn't sure that was what I wanted to be left with when you'd taken me to this garden somewhere else. So yeah, no, it was lovely.
Thank you.
Yeah, can I just echo that as well? That it is. I mean, what everybody has said, it is really lovely. You created really this sort of a, like, really effectively sort of a engaging sort of a couple of minutes that speaks to a lot of people clearly, even if it's your personal sort of a, like, narrative at the same time. But there's so many elements, and the ways in which I think it's something about, and I'm not a specialist, but I think the ways in which you can do the soundscape transitions are really smooth, and they work like a charm, at least to me as well. There's only a couple of bits in the film as well that I sort of also felt that I wasn't sure about the feathers either. And then also that when you sort of had really briefly the box of the instrument early on, I don't know if that's necessary, but that is completely another not a super relevant point as well. I was trying to think through also similar terms as well of what is the role of a very contemporary moment, but also memory. But perhaps then already the idea of what is a contemporary includes these multiple other sorts of levels. And I guess there's something about exactly like perhaps bit what, in a very different key, but still, like we just talked with Anya as well, that a certain kind of a performance of relationships is so instrumental in terms of their liveliness as well. And there's something about this as well, about the sort of a little snippets of stories or exchanged messages and the ways in which I think there's a kind of a really interesting construction going on there as well that makes it so lively and lovely, while it's also based on sort of a kind of a like imagery and other sort of things about memory. I was trying to think of a question about the fox, but I can't come up with a question, but I'm curious about what it, and there's a sort of a danger that I would go into sort of like a longer thing about like non-human animals. But if you have anything to kind of that you want to sort of whether that's a sort of a key element and in which ways, if you want to continue a bit more about the fox or any other sort of a non-human animals there as well, it might be interesting to add to this as well. So this is a very open question, but yeah, it's one of the elements that really I was left thinking about the fox movement, how it moves both in relation to the screen, but also what sort of a like allusion, what does it sort of speak to in terms of movement outside restricted boundaries, for instance?
Mm-hmm. Well, the fox is one of many foxes that live in the garden. There's a massive wood pile, and they live in that. They live under the chestnut tree. They live under the shed. So they've kind of been taking over the garden, and they're basically good company for my dad. I think he goes out there. He actually takes his hat off to them. There's a poem by Ted Hughes called "The Thought Fox," which is really beautiful, and it's about imagining something that is as kind of vivid as the fox, including the smell and the touch, but you're not there. You're at home. It's dark. You're not there. So it was kind of that thought fox, thought father dichotomy. There's also the paths also that we take in the garden are the paths that the fox takes without even kind of being aware of it. And then suddenly when my dad sent me the video and I watched them, I said, okay, can you go back and walk where the fox walks? So then I kind of told him to do that, even though we'd already been doing that all this time, we just didn't even realize. So
that's super interesting.
Yeah.
Because there's something about exactly passages, sort of a territorial refrains and repetitions by animals, and how co-sharing of spaces works in these ways that sort of sometimes resonate, sometimes diverges. So there's something about patterns and rhythms of that
Yes.
seemingly contains space, but actually it's such a dynamic and on multiple levels. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a friend actually who's a horticulturalist, and she said, if you want to plan your garden, you should first figure out, where the sun comes, where the wind goes, but where the badger walks through your garden, because you don't want to plant stuff there because it'll be destroyed.
Amazing.
I also enjoyed it a lot, Emma, as well. And I found myself, a handful of things occurred to me. One, it triggered, even in the 2 minutes and 18 seconds, I was actually participating with my father, who died 20 some years ago. And I wondered if there would be something about leveraging other memory constructions outside of the immediacy of yours with your father, if there would be ways to offer as a kind of a gifting, let's say, that you would use the film as a way to trigger not so much your relationship, but other relationships that people might have who are engaging the film. So that was sort of one thought that I had. Second thought had to do with really trying to understand the role that the film plays in the development now in your work. So is it a cipher for a spatial setup or a set of artifacts that you might make, for example? Or is the immediacy of the film what you really want to cultivate? So that I guess maybe the roles that the film plays with respect to the larger framework of your work. In other words, you could say it just structures relationships, not between you and your father, but particular relational conditions. And I'm going to set up a totally different environment, which cultivates those relational conditions, but doesn't rely on the personal construction of my relationship to my father in the garden and the foxes and the badger and so on. So just the roles it plays. Then there was something about there are single shots, there are diptychs, there are triptychs, there are composites. And I wondered if that felt a touch jumpy to me. It felt like the techniques, I was paying attention to the techniques probably because we're architects or in the visual arts and we're reflecting on the structure of things. And I wondered, it felt like I was trying to pay attention. When a diptych would show up, I'm paying attention to the history of diptychs. And then when a triptych would show up, or a kind of Robert Rauschenberg moment where there were a series of things composited. So I found myself participating in the techniques also of the construction of the film, which was a nice parallel life, but I lost track of the content sometimes. And I wondered if there would be a way to work out whether the techniques, does that make sense? There are a lot of techniques in 2¼ minutes there. So I might think about that. And I wonder just quickly, do you know the work of Francis Yates and Luria, The Mind of the Mnemonist by Luria, and the Art of Memory by Francis Yates? I just wondered if you would be interested in if there's an interest in memory constructions. The Art of Memory would be the one to go to, Francis Yates, who really discusses how memory constructions work and so on. The other thing that I got interested in, and I think Mark would know this, I think Neil Spiller, it's a term that I use. I love the split geography problem, where we're here and there simultaneously, and that's obviously linked to mediation historically. But I wondered if there would be a way to, your here seem to be slightly out of the equation. It seems like there's a leaning towards the garden and your father and so on. And I wonder if the here, not always the there, might be a thing to work with. And
yeah. No,
the distanciations, the removals, the withdrawals for you, there's a kind of a longing. The film has a kind of a longing or a desire for you to be there. And I wondered if there'd be a way to that here and there problem that diagram might be worked over a little bit through the development of your work. Yeah,
no, that's a really good point. I think when I was making it, it was very hard to get the balance right between the longing to be there and the reality of the situation that we're in. I didn't want to go too far into, oh, I'm so sad here, I can't be there, that kind of thing, because I think it wouldn't have been as rewarding. I think it would have just kind of dragged me down a bit. But yeah, I think, I mean, the only video that I took was me holding the ice.
Yeah.
And that came at a point when my dad was talking about the bleakness of winter, but I'm holding the ice and it's like bright. Yeah. So I liked the play of the kind of what I'm experiencing and then what he's experiencing are not actually the same thing. I mean, it's not that far away. It's about 60 miles. Sometimes it's really bright sun there and it's really, really cloudy here. And I'm like, how is it so sunny there? So yeah, but I think that definitely the distance and like you said, the structure and I was trying to hold a lot of threads together. So it was quite a delicate operation. But yeah.
It almost has it's almost like a visual scrapbook in a way. And I wondered about things like scrapbooks as weight. You know, scrapbooks, is that a term there? Yeah. It has a sort of quality of familiarity and family, constructions over a period of time. And so I was, on the one hand, interested in that, but the technique question still was around for me in terms of the multiple techniques in such a short period of time.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on that point about here and there. I think that's really important. And going forward, maybe you asked the question at the beginning, what can the relationship be between this film and taking it forward into your project, right? I think what would be really interesting would be to think about that as a kind of composite space between your space and his space in the now, but also the kind of phantoms of the past that float in and out, and try and draw that. Try to, as you would draw you know, try and draw your space as part of a project, I think it would be really interesting to try and depict that kind of fusion where it's mediated, okay, through WhatsApp calls or Skype or audio or even film. But actually it's a shared space. And at the moment, the shared space is only his space because it's the only one that both of you know. But if you could create a kind of collaborative space that includes your space, then I think there's a potential for him to be adding or collaborating within your space as well as within his. So it's a kind of forward looking, you know, can you construct a kind of shared, and I like the scrapbook analogy as well, you know, that this, because that's a kind of collaborative thing to do quite often. And the idea that you would be both kind of custodians of this this kind of shared hybrid space that doesn't sit next to each other but does in some ways, right, in mediated ways, in technologically kind of fused ways. And how would you draw that? You know, do you do some quick photogrammetry of your space and his space, get him to take a load of photographs and then actually start to construct it digitally, and then think about how you might represent it, how you might take us through it. I think that could be interesting. Yeah. And it's the thought fox, isn't it? I love that. You know, that he needs to, you know, also be able to conceptualize your space, I think, for it to be going both ways.
Yeah.
Tanya, sorry.
And yeah, just to kind of, we're talking about space, but I think we could just as easily be talking about habitat, because there was, yeah, it was a garden space. It wasn't an unbound space, but you know, I see more foxes in the city than I do. I mean, your father's garden's unusual. I don't see them in Devon. They're all really? Sort of prowling around Hackney or looking for chicken or, you know, fried chicken. Actually, not like live chicken. So I don't know. It just felt like. Yeah, there's something about you've made your own habitat where you are, and I think that's just as kind of rich as a subject. And given, you know, your role in the world will be to create habitats, create spaces, create places that are that important for others. Yeah, you know, that will contain all these relationships and all these events and memories and all these, you know, I just think address your, I think that's really good thought to turn your attention to your own space, your own habitat as well.
Yeah.
I love the word habitat, Tanya. Yeah, but I also wondered, the fox seems like a really interesting character because it talks about an outside world, doesn't it? It talks about things which are external to you and your father. And also we know all kinds of children's stories and so on that are told through the eyes of animals. And I wonder if there would be a way to also share those stories as a sort of third party through the fox and blah, blah, blah. And the other thing I was thinking about just quickly is when Kate was mentioning the simultaneity of spaces, I remember the first time I saw a painted ceiling in a church where I could be sort of with the gods, as it were, and standing on the ground, you know, eating a sandwich at the same time. And I wondered if you would look at things where there were double worlds happening simultaneously. I'm not asking you to make a painted ceiling in a church, of course, but and the co-construction that Kate mentioned seemed also super interesting, because it also suggests that there's an indeterminacy to things, or that there would be future memories, and there would be, and I wondered about developing an infrastructure that would hold not only this film, but also future memories as a constructible infrastructure for you and your father and the fox, let's say, so that it were indeterminate or less finite relationships, that we could begin to project other memories, other relationships that you might have with the garden, the fox, and your father. A sort of format that allows this one to be one of many, a kind of another kind of a scrapbook.
Yeah, that's really nice. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, we have spent a lot of time together there. The last thing that we did was plant a native hedge in last February together. But there was a nice story I was thinking of suburban gardens and the habitats. This is, you know, one wild element. There was think in Cambridgeshire, there was a lady who recorded 10,000 species in her one single garden in Cambridgeshire, and there's just so much life there that, yeah, can definitely be that's significant in a small space. Yeah.
I'm just conscious of the time. Perhaps I don't know if anyone has any final thoughts, or Emma, if you had any final burning questions for the panel.
Not burning, no, just to say thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Emma. It's a lovely film. I really look forward to seeing how it develops, how it kind of sparks a bigger project.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, Vasilis.
Okay, hi.
How do I say it? Tell me.
It's good, great.
Okay. Do it.
I've uploaded the video on YouTube, and I'm just sharing the link now with everyone just to be safe. I really don't know what was wrong with the sharing screen thing. The project addresses the ongoing crisis of soil degradation and depopulation in the upland territory of England by proposing new shelters for nature, wildlife, and humans. Currently, under the European Common Agricultural Policy, farmers get taxpayers' money based on the amount of land they farm. This is highly problematic. The richer the farmer, the more the grant. The British government will replace the existing CAP with new environmental land management system, which will pay farmers for the production of public goods, such as preventing floods, planting woods, or helping to restore wildlife. However, upland hill farming is an unhealthily subsidized industry and one highly toxic to the upland environment. Sheep, which feed on grass, are ancient devices of control. They keep the grass low, clean of weeds and trees, and only 2% of food consumed within the UK is produced from hill farming, the rest of it coming from the lowlands. The project proposes an alternative vision for the upland territory by introducing a new, younger population that will settle in the uplands, and with the main goal of restoring the soil by producing subsidized public goods. To achieve this, 3 sheltering devices are identified and activated in the territory. The cowhouse, which used to house cattle and store whey before sheep took over, and which today stands mostly derelict. The dry stone wall, an enclosing device built with local stone, and one which has been identified as a vital host of wildlife and flora. And the copse, a controlled piece of woodland which is never allowed to naturally expand, as the grazing sheep consume all its falling seeds, and farmers make sure to keep it in control in order to keep qualifying for government subsidies on their grass pasture. The farms will be replanted to introduce new common land, the old idea of a ground that belongs to the people. In feudal England, registered commoners who lived in the manor could graze their animals without direct ownership on common land. The commons were an asset to the population, a vital resource. But after the enclosures over the past 800 years, the commons were lost. What remains of them today is hardly active. In many cases, not a single person is registered on a piece of land. And the upland landscape has changed, from productive land to a form of constantly manicured leisure land. The existing devices will give way to new shelters, placed on common land to either directly help the soil there, or as a base for the new commoners to expand their conservation efforts to other areas. The new commons will vary in size, from a 2-meter buffer of a dry stone wall edge, or more rarely the entire field. The new shelters derive from an existing architecture of the uplands. New woodlands will be formed using existing tree species that can withstand the hard upland soil. Expanded dry stone walls will create new habitats for wildlife, nature, and humans. And the commons, which for so long have been isolated and underused, will connect again, creating true rights of way. Each commoner living in a cowhouse will be interlinked with an area to be preserved, reforested, or secured. The new upland commoner is not a visitor. They are part of the land. The upland territory is restored, new biocultural heritage is established, and the soil is alive again. I guess the project maybe I can respond to the fact that manager kind of focused on the idea that we're working remotely. So I think for me to, I come from Cyprus, I live in London, and the uplands are way north of England. And due to the restrictions, I've actually not really managed to visit them in person. And I think by trying to visualize the uplands, not just in drawing form, but in like a more three-dimensional way, I think this is really what the project has taught me about lockdown, that in a way, if I can find enough data, I can construct, I can try to reconstruct these environments without really being there. And of course, it's not like this the real thing, but it's more able to be manipulated and to then be a base for proposals, I think. So yeah, I mean, I really want to visit, but waiting until the lockdown ends.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I had a question. It seemed like a really positive proposal. Who will be against it?
Right. I don't know if you're familiar by the power of the hill farmer, or in general the farmer in the UK. So in a way, the more I was looking into the idea of hill farming, the more I realized that it's kind of this ancient way of looking at land, and what the sheep do is it's specifically the sheep are I'm not going to call the sheep problematic, but in a way, the way that they function is the fact that they can only eat very precious grass. They can't eat any sort of kind of more wild wild manure, so or food. So in a way, they are the ones that have to have this kind of polished and very manicured environment in order to be able to live. But then I also realized that through government subsidies and through this kind of these renegotiation between the farmers and the government after Brexit, that things would change for sure, for them and for other farmers. And in a way, the UK is getting half of its food imported right now, and I predict that this will be even bigger at some point. So by the government trying to create this kind of public goods to first benefit the environment, but also benefit the farmers, I think the environment might win in this, which is good news in a way. But on the other hand, the farmer is kind of left to stay at their land and possibly retire. They're all growing older, and like there's not enough people starting to farm. But the project in the upland says that maybe farming there is not really the answer. Maybe the answer is just letting some sort of rewilding, basically, like letting the land go back to its permaculture. So trying to see it for what it is and what it can do most productively.
Okay, I think because that in there is the tension that you need, I think, in the project, right? Between whose benefit, who gets to decide and for whose benefit, and I think a lot of this is local stakeholders might disagree with non-local stakeholders making proposals for the benefit maybe of a common good, as opposed to a kind of a local good. So I think that for me, it doesn't have enough tension in it in the way that you present it at the moment. I'll stop talking and throw it open to Jussi.
Yeah, perhaps I'll pick up on this as well. I mean, I really do like the project. It's got so many super interesting elements as well, and the sort of ways in which well, basically, exactly. particular architectural angle towards buildings, but actually buildings only as triggers for particular kinds of processes. So actually it's an architecture of processes that are dynamic and living already de facto, but it's a form of really rethinking of how it feeds back to thinking what is architectural practice in relation to living processes on a massive scale, like soil or whoever inhabits, non-human animals inhabits the soil as well, right? What I'm interested in is perhaps this might be exactly what Kate was also after, is that you did frame it in relation to post-Brexit EU regulations and in relation to current, but there's something about architecture and law here, and not just any law, but property law that is so really interesting, because you refer back to commons and you refer back to the sort of current processes, but I'm not, what's the sort of are you able to talk a bit more about the sort of property ownership basis of those lands in relation to your thinking as well, if that makes sense as a question? Yeah.
So the main area that I'm looking at is a national park called Yorkshire Dales, and most of it is in the uplands. It's considered to be in the upland territory, and 96% of it is in private ownership. So that means that as a national park, whenever it tries to do something that is for the people, it kind of starts to the authorities there start to face problems that come with private property. And in general, England and the UK is very high concentration of private property. So when I was starting to look at how we could not fix it, of course, I don't think that anything can fix things as a proposal, but just to try to address it in a way, I looked at common land and realized that at some point most of the UK was common land. So it meant that actually this was land for the people. So even though they were living in feudal England and they had definitely a lord of the manor and much stricter rules, the commoners could benefit directly from the land without having to go through the kind of the expected today, like what we do today, which is someone farms something for us and then we go and get the food and buy it from the shop, and then it kind of goes through this process. But in a way, it was very much a connection that has been lost for one reason or another. So by recommoning the uplands, basically trying to create these zones of common land that would connect different parcels of land together, I think, and basing any proposal there, but then making it just as a base, not really saying this is the area that I'm going to fix, but actually this is the area where the people that will fix everything else will live. Then I think the project kind of tries to mediate between not really being able to commonize everything, because of course we're talking about a very complex system of ownership, but just take a bit of land and give it to the environment, to people that are willing to conserve nature.
Yeah, so it really boils down to exactly sort of that sort of question of what probably exactly looking into what are the sort of implications of a particular term like public vis-a-vis commons, and the notion of public goods that can be still privatized. And there's a lot there that is probably entangled, and it becomes an interesting imaginary proposal to create new kinds of not just buildings but actual lawscapes, to use the term by the legal philosopher Andreas Philippopoulos Michalopoulos, the lawscape where it can be enacted is sort of a living system. So there's something interesting in those connections, I think. I mean, there's a lot of interesting there in multiple things. Thank you.
This is anecdotal, but I live in the rural southwest of the UK in Devon, and I live in an old mill, and I'm a commoner of Lappet Common. The property I live in has a certain percentage of the common that's land that's up on the hill in the village, and there are parish meetings where this your common land usage is determined on an annual basis. So I live in a community that is practicing this. You know, in effect, it's kind of run by some old boys with beef cattle. And, you know, I have certain rights on that to gather certain stuff and do certain things, but I don't actually have time for sheep. I have a day job. But it is really interesting to be part of that community and think about that as a potential model going forward. And there are so many areas of the UK or globally where this could be a very useful model. But you know, your proposal is very remote. You know, these things will come down to relationships and communities, and how these ideas land with those communities, and yeah, trying to have those community, you know, what would incentivize those communities to move forward with this thinking would probably be financial incentives, the same thing that's incentivized them to keep sheep, or switch from dairy to beef, or they might be switching to something else now there's less meat being eaten. But you know, and the farming community is a land-owning community. It's a very slow-moving community, and yeah, it's naturally conservative, naturally well, naturally is such a loaded word, I don't know why I'm using it, but you know, that the trend is to conservatism, and yeah, it's a, you know, I loved the proposal. I really loved the way it integrated architecture and imagining new kind of communities around existing structures and that sort of thing. But I think it kind of didn't demonstrate connection to the world and to communities that have put land into common ownership. You know, there are Scottish islands that are community owned. I'm saying I'm a commoner. You know, I wanted to see it. I wanted to feel it connected. Like you'd actually thought through, how do you reach people with this? I think you've understood why you might do it, but not how you might do it. And again, that's very hard in our kind of situation. I was also curious, like, oh, I wonder how does this overmap onto Cyprus? Maybe that, I don't know how, you said you were from Cyprus, I think, but you know, I don't know if you lived here forever or you recently here from Cyprus, you know, just any kind of comparative approach to land ownership, land usage, land conservation, regeneration, you know, how agriculture gets involved with regenerative agriculture is a really important process, and I love that you're giving it your attention. But there's a lot of work to do with people and personalities, and yeah, as well as the politics of this. But anyway, I've probably said too much, but it just struck me, you know, I never get to tell anyone I'm a commoner. I thought it was appropriate today, just so you know it's happening. And it has always happened in the village I live in.
So what do you do as a what can you do on that piece of land?
I can gather bracken as winter bedding. I could bid to keep my sheep or my cattle up on the common. I should get involved with various bits of clearing, or that. Actually, one of the things we did get involved with is there was a proposal to fence an area of it, and we said you shouldn't fence it. Wow. And that was the only time I think I've actually exercised my commoners' rights, was to stop something happening rather than to do something on it. But if I did switch to a smallholder, I would be using it more. But yeah.
I think just to add to that, I mean, one point is you asked about Cyprus, and I think the reason maybe why this project is very interesting to me is the fact that in Cyprus, we would never see a farm as a national park. or a sort of landscape that we could visit and appreciate for its beauty, we would see it productively, and we would see it for what it is in a way. And I'm not saying that's the right way or anything, but the fact that it has been so ingrained in our culture to see the uplands as this kind of what's it called, kind of shaped and landscape that is very clean of trees, very clean of people, almost like everyone basically. So just sheep being managed on private property, that's what kind of struck me as something that I could go into and look at. And second, just a reflection on the fact that you said that the only time that you practice as a commoner is when you have to stop things from happening. I think this is a very good way to understand common land right now, especially not in a city, not in a rural, not in an urban setting, because common land has been around for so long that we have changed so much in the way that we work and in the way that we farm and everything. So I think this is also an opportunity for me to redefine maybe what a common land can give to a commoner, because it's not really anymore about being able to practice, I think it's called pescary. No, that's collecting fish. There's like these really old words basically of what you can do on common land. So there's a word for collecting twigs and for coppicing and all these things, but we don't really need that anymore. And I think it's a bit we could reimagine what it could be used for in a way, which actually what the project will try and do in this term and the next, I think, as well. So this is why it kind of feels. But thank you.
I'm enjoying the conversation a lot. Thanks for the work. I wondered a couple of things, maybe to pick up on the thread of where the conversation is now. I wondered if you thought of the work as structural or specific, and does that make sense? That you would be setting up principles through prototypes, or it's like, I think of the work that Kate and Liam have done in Unknown Fields Division as being structural. They look at very, very specific conditions, but it's transferable, and one can begin to pick up on certain relational properties and insights and forms of interrogation and so on. That was one thing I was thinking about, whether you wanted to play bigger than the local condition. The second thing for me was when or whens you would locate your work. And I began to wonder if there were key moments in the histories of the development of, say, the uplands or common property or legal ramifications in the history of England, for example, where you might partially locate aspects of your work to realign things which have realign, reframe, critically unpack where you are today. Because right now it has the immediacy of the now seems present, but you're looking at things which have been have changed over quite a long period of time. And a military tactician, for example, might look at something that happened in 1935, and I wondered if you might distribute your work, moving between policy reconstruction in 1971 in relationship to spatial attitudes and tactics right now, and if it might help to diversify when and in which mediums you are trying to allocate your work. Does that make?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very valid comment.
You can imagine that it's some of the key things happened in 1795, and your work also is tickling common land things that got lost because of this creed, blah 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 blah. I'll be quick about the last one, and I don't think I feel strongly about this, but it seemed interesting to me. I was interested in the ways you're working on it. Right now, there's a kind of pictorial rendition of things, and I wondered, because of your distances from the site, if there might be a digital equivalent to things like harvesting and land right issues, and if you might begin to cultivate things within a digital medium that would allow you to construct the parallel world to grazing and copses and planting strategies, and through pixels and file sizes and the ways in which things get erased and remembered. It's an aside, it's an interest of mine, how the digital workspace, maybe in addition to the pictorial structure that you're advancing, how it might allow you to produce a parallel construction to do with temporal things and ownership and stabilities and indeterminacies and so on. And just I'll take that away with me and, you know, sort of work on that at midnight tonight myself. It just interests me, and how to work on such work.
I think that's a really fascinating point. I would really love to see you using satellite imagery and actually interrogating how that's used to monitor the land use, etc. It's the complexity that's missing a little bit, isn't it? I think complexity in kind of understanding the site dynamics, and that's not just spatial but social, economic, cultural, you know, so that I think you need a more complex kind of web of site dynamics that you understand a little bit more, so that you can intervene in a way that's a little bit more sophisticated and complex as well, and that I suppose acknowledges the tensions, the difficulties. And I think that's what's missing a little bit. It has ends a little bit of a full stop, whereas actually the project needs to open out into a whole host of questions. Sorry, Tanya, I'll shut up now.
No, I think all really important. And I've put a link in the chat. I was working this week and last week at the Leverhulme Centre for the Anthropocene Biodiversity at the University of York with a group of PhD and postdoc students and researchers, and a lot of them, their subject was biodiversity in relation to land use over time. And some of these young researchers are absolute specialists in the thing you're talking about, but they're not necessarily looking to apply it to strategies around land use projecting forward with your hypothesis, but they would be great to connect to. It's the Leverhulme fund this centre, I believe. It's fairly new, or maybe it's the Wellcome. I think it's the Leverhulme. But there is, it's quite a small group of student body, but a bit of searching, and I mean, if you can't find people, I can try and look them up. Some of those PhD researchers I was talking to, you'd have a really good conversation with them, and they've got some really interesting strategies for visualizing what they understand about changing land use and how that intersects with biodiversity particularly. So I don't know if you like collaboration, but I think they'd be great to get involved with what you're talking about.
Yeah. Thank you. Actually, collaboration is like a really big part of my diploma's brief in a way. So it's also very like.
And it's the site specificity. I mean, obviously they take their surrounding area as part of their subject for some of them, not all of them, but yeah, they would know the land you're talking about. So yeah, might be a good connection.
Thank you.
Fantastic. I'm just conscious of the time, unless there are any other burning thoughts from the panel or from yourself.
Throwing Grisdale Arts there as well. Have a look at what they do. I mean, that's arts organisation, but
sorry, I missed that. I missed the first bit.
Grisdale Arts.
Grisdale Arts. Okay.
Yeah, and it's not exactly the same area, but it's a bit further north, more the Lake District. But again, looking at the aesthetics of land usage, the politics of land usage, environmental questions as well. So you might like what they've been doing over the last couple of decades, actually. So.
Yeah, I think it's a big injection of realism. But in its most fruitful way, right? What are the ingenious ways to mobilize what you've proposed? What are the byproducts? Where the sheep go? What are the changes culturally that will be created, you know, good and bad? I think that if you can absorb the good and bad, you create a kind of rounded project, and then more open-ended. I would make a pitch if you haven't done any GIS or kind of stuff in the past. There's a workshop on Saturday you could join, which Oscar's running. He's pretty full, but I'm gonna if you email him, I'm sure he'll see what he can do. We can always put on an extra session. But I think it would give you another dimension. I think that's a really good point, to include a kind of technological understanding of the land, you know, a contemporary technological vision of it. Okay, thank you, Vasilis. We are going to go to our final.
Thank you, everyone.
Victim. Tell me how to pronounce your name.
You can call me AJ.
AJ, perfect. Okay, AJ. I think we're okay for time. We'll make our discussion at the end a bit shorter. AJ, take it away.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. So my name is AJ, and I'm in DIP 16, which is a film-based unit. Due to our timeline, I will give a really brief presentation of the project before sharing a YouTube link for extract of my film. So my documentary film project looks at the spatial and social changes within China's rural areas that are now undergoing the process of modern urbanization. It is to unpack the architectural and the social asymmetries within a dissolving rurality through a close observation on the relationship between people and space. Historically, from 1950s to 70s, rural villages were under a systematic transformation led by people's commune movement. The commune, as the basic unit of Chinese society, reinforces the rural collective social identity that is based on association, relations, and care. As the rural commune where my family and I have lived for 4 generations is now facing imminent displacement, this has become the site for my film and research. With high-rise housing towers and large-scale highways, the rural land is flattened, extruded, divided, gated, and commercialized. Most importantly, we are losing the collective memory associated with the land. Urbanization not only transforms the spatial characteristics of the rural countryside, but also affects the subjects of space by imposing modern housing typologies, which systematically changes people's occupation, family structures, social behaviors, cultural activities in the name of reaching modernity. Through framing the practice of everyday life, the collective memory can be recaptured, archived, and recounted through the camera lenses. Since last October, I've been following 6 characters as my daily routine, documenting different ways of life, helping me better understand the sense of place, scales of domesticity, and the spatiality of rituals and the modes of labor. For my ETS 5 project, I'm building an open air cinema for displaying the final film in June. The selected 3 stories within today's condensed film gives an overview of my observation on the relationship between subjects and space at different scales. The first old lady in her 60s living by herself in the village as her only son moved to the city. A retired old couple displaced 10 years ago, but still come back and farm at their allocated farmland. The third subject is the lady who recently got displaced to a new housing tower on the south side of village. So I think my film does not only react to the urgency for documenting a dissolving rurality, but also acts as my resistance to the political, social, and cultural imbalance within this transformation. So my film is named A Dissolving Rurality. I will share the YouTube link in the chat. It can be played at 1080p resolution. And today is the first day in lunar calendar. I wish you all happy Chinese New Year. Please enjoy the film.
娘那干了，今天干了说，等你放假了，你不放假我多干了。
一般黑的那个裤子要错的嘞。
What is it?
AJ, do you want to, I think it's quite useful for critics to have a quick summary after they've seen the film as well as before the project, and then just kind of outline as far as I understand it, your proposal is a film and then a cinema to house the film. So it'd be quite nice to understand the relationship between those two things, and is there a site for the cinema, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so our unit is a film-based unit, and we see films as an architectural project in order to help us understand the site, the relationship between people and space through this kind of observation through the camera lenses into the mundane life of people in order to better understand, as an architect, how do we design, how do we reflect on urban issues, especially for this year. And we're trying to unpack through this film, trying to unpack social and cultural issues through this documenting different ways of living. So that's sort of the general sort of intent of the project. And for my project, this is a site of my home and also for my family. And we're about to be displaced this year in the coming months. And I have been away for 10 years abroad. So when I came back in this pandemic, I went straight away to this to see the village as the site for my project. And the film for me, it is an act of engagement and a proposal in order to achieve a certain degree of changes even. as to see it as an archive, as something that people can reflect on later.
Okay, and the relationship to the cinema, you're designing a building, a cinema, a small pavilion. Like, is that a key part of the project? Is there a critical relationship between those two things?
So the design of the cinema is separated from the film. When I say design, I mean the concept of it, the construction of it. It's purely for the technical project. But I think the cinema itself as a part of the film is acting as a sort of a conclusion or to amplify what the film can do in space and in time for the site.
Okay, thank you. I'll throw it open to our three critics.
I don't know if I'm muted. Am I muted?
No, you're good. You're good.
Well, congratulations. That was really powerful, just straight away. Incredible sense of intimacy and trust, relationships with your subjects. This was not a camera sort of happening to them, it was happening with them. Yeah, it was very, very powerful. And you're bearing witness to a process that's been in place since the Industrial Revolution, but you know, our tools for bearing witness to this narrative are very different now, and I think you're using your tools incredibly well to describe the process of depopulation of rural areas, displacement, urbanization. It's a really powerful record, and I think it's I'm also really encouraged by the idea that you've built in the idea of delivering it back to your participants, that they are the audience for the film as well as anyone else that will see it, and thinking about the structure to deliver that to them and everything it feels very complete, actually, that you've given that element consideration too. So I really enjoyed it.
Thank
you. Thank you very much. I also enjoyed it a lot. I would like to watch it again before I say something substantial, because there's such really lovely subtle things going on that are powerful, also in terms of sound, of how the soundscape or design. It's sort of a kind of a, especially towards the end, there was something that, you know, I would need to see it again. This might sound very different, but I just finished reading that wonderful essay collection on the blockchain chicken farm, which is on basically transformation of exactly Chinese rural areas, and the sort of a like interesting technological juxtapositions that are going on with increasingly, you know, both these processes that you describe in the film, but also then technologization and multiple social and economic consequences. So it's this interesting sort of a really like this, like also like big themes that are really dealt with this very sort of a like focused and delicate ways in yours as well, in terms of, for instance, technologization through the means of a technological medium, cinema itself, that speaks to a very different sort of a pace, at least in your take. And I'm interested in how to, again, I'm using this very broadly, the term specify, but how to think through what is the, if you use the word, you used a couple of times the archive, that the cinematic is the archive, which is super interesting. But I wonder if there would be ways of also like, where does the archive take us then? Is the archive there for mourning? Is it there as a registration of a certain kind of a wound? Is it there sort of a like a thing that can have, how can it feed forward to something? So there's something about the archive that I feel that could be unpacked in really interesting ways. as a both a term, but perhaps a kind of a guiding theme in terms of the cinematic as well. But I'm not able to really place it. There's something about, again, these questions that we dealt with in a different context earlier about space and memory and space and archive and cinema there at the center of it as well, or sort of, let's say, moving images as well. So there's something again there in those themes that is on a different level, different aesthetic part of your thing as well. But I mean, this doesn't come out as a question, but I think it's something about perhaps if we want to, if we want to talk more about what is the investment in the archive as a central part of the cinematic, and if you have further thoughts in how it might feed into your practice, it's interesting. This is a very open question again. I don't know if it's answerable.
Yeah, I can respond a little bit. I think the archive idea didn't start with I want to archive. I think it started with this idea of what is a collective memory, and what is the importance of it, and how did it come from on a theoretical level and also on the a practical level. So I was reading about the Marti Howak's his essay on collective memory, and how he described this idea of the elders, which also presented the part of the reason I selected today's characters. So the elders, they were this kind of they are not act as a record of history. They are more taking the history more as a mind map of what happened and what is the hidden story of a site, of a culture, and which completes a much better image than what is written. And that is really the construction for what a community can be and what that is. So for me, the collection of this memory, of shared memory in the site, sort of kind of feeds into the idea of archiving. And then the archive as a mechanism, which I want to sort of take the not only film, but also the cinema as well as a whole, to kind of trigger what the archive should do, which can talk much more across time and space.
Yeah, that's super interesting what you said, and that sort of helps to really zoom in on certain key questions. And there's something, I mean, again, in terms of our topic of this site and the multiplication of sites that happens through technical medium like cinema as well, but then also what you just said about implications of multiplication of temporal and historical layers in relation to space itself being constantly multiplied, and hence also conflicting and full of conflicts as well on multiple levels. I think there's a lot there in terms of this mode of understanding cinema and archivics, those terms as well. Good.
I was also very much moved by the film, AJ, and loving the comments you see. And Tanya, I wondered a couple of things, and not comprehensive thinking at all. It seems to me to be maybe important to move away from things like naming the archive and the cinema to what they actually structure. And that might begin to allow you to open up the multiple worlds and techniques by which things might be available to you. And so that's one thing. I was thinking about also, just at the end of your thinking, AJ, the roles of memory theaters. Do you know memory theaters? Where the architecture played a role. So roughly, people were trying to learn to speak publicly, and the architecture would help them remember the parts of the speech, and their eyes would move, and they would occupy the architecture to construct the so that they knew what to say. So public oration, memory theaters. And I wondered if there might be a way to use spatial constructions as a way to construct collective memory things, maybe in parallel to something like memory theaters, Matteo Ricci, and so on, memory theaters. So architecture played quite a nice role in constructing the possibility of not only recovering memories, but also projecting things beyond what the speaker would know. again, these are detached thoughts. I also wondered about, I was thinking about Luigi Pirandello's 6 characters in search of an author, and roughly Tanya's, and everybody, yeah. Do you know the film or the play?
I'm not sure.
Roughly, and I like to get it wrong because it's helpful to make certain kinds of arguments. I think it roughly goes like this. There's a play being rehearsed, which has known ambitions. There are 6 characters who turn up from another play whose author didn't finish the play, essentially. And somehow now it's this negotiation between one setup and another setup that doesn't know where it's going. And I wondered if you could use a kind of the metaphorical construction of that kind of, in terms of the rural disappearance and the kind of impending rapid urbanization processes. I wonder if you could use, say, structural models of things which look at pairs or conjoined things which leverage certain relational properties to help you say things about what you want to say. By a kind of diptychal relationship between things. Anyway, that might be worth a look. And then I was thinking about films like, do you know Dogville by Lars von Trier? It's a story of a woman, and it's Colorado, and the narrative is less consequential at the moment, the content. But what it is it's sort of, you're sort of on a back lot. And there are parts of a town drawn, like plans drawn on the floor of the ground plane, and then there are architectural elements and there are entouragic elements. So there's a real incomplete sense to it. And I was thinking about your cinema, and if things like jigs and rigs and props, if it might be that there's a kind of mobility to the construction of the cinema that was more agile, more plastic, more helpful for you in terms of, rather than the, this goes back to the naming problem, and rather maybe you make a cinema, but maybe it's more the construction of that cinema and the enactment of things through the construction of the cinema, the film, the stage props, and so on. Just sort of metaphorically, if it might allow you a form of agility that allows you to touch on a range of things rather than consolidate them in a kind of cinema format. Yeah. Dogville is quite nice. Just the spatial setup is quite nice. Also that it's, the Dogma 95, the Credo, handheld cameras and lo-fi production, and it has a sort of a workaday quality to it. Just jigs and rigs rather than stages and curtains. That there might be a whole set of apparati and entouragic elements and so on that might help you populate the discussion you want to foreground or format.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
I had a question, OJ. I don't know, this might seem completely inappropriate, but would you, because of the course you're on and your choice of profession, would there be any interest in you turning your attention on the build process and, I don't know, filming in the architect's office, or sort of the other what's advancing? It's so beautiful what you're doing. It's complete. The project is complete, but it just made me wonder, because you're trying to be an architect ultimately, and I wonder what your relationship is with being on the other side. If this is binary, I don't know if it is, that's oversimplifying, but who are the architects building those buildings? What's their understanding of the communities that are being displaced? How are they even discussed? I don't know, it might be interesting to kind of bear witness to the other, I want to say the other side. I know that's reductionist, but it feels like there could be a conversation or a parallel investigation of what that looks like, the kind of shiny surfaces of all of that, the polish, what progress looks like, potentially. I think you could make a very interesting companion work. looking at what progress looks like from their point of view.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with all the comments. Actually, I think I feel like I want to see outside the bounds of the film in one way or another, right? So whether that's, I think there's an opportunity in this cinema structure, and I agree with Perry about the naming. I mean, if you think about what it offers that you wouldn't be achieved through someone watching it on their laptop, for instance, right? It's public, it's potentially a public site, a collective site. It has a site, that's one really important thing. Or a series, it might be a roaming project. It might contain the instructions for a wider film project, of which this one film is a kind of example. So I'm thinking kind of the 7-Up series and things like that, or actually your project might be a kind of infrastructure for the production of a series of films over a number of years that then is a bigger project. Does that make sense? And so it's not only the film in itself, but the film in itself is nested within a series of kind of logistics, or it's a proposal, a framework for laying down this kind of fragile structure that you're revealing. I mean, it comes to mind kind of a flower press, you know. I think you need that you would kind of delicately use film, a structure for a film, to kind of to embed these very fragile moments that you're focusing on in the film that you could never really write down and you could never really capture in a photograph, and to find what is it about what you can find in the film that cannot be captured any other way. And I agree, you know, I think it could be within to acknowledge the film as a structure and as a media, and to look at it as a form in itself and as a site. It is a site, and you were taking that as your site at the moment. I think could be really, really, really fruitful. And then it becomes propositional without needing to be propositional. You know, I think you've got to find the ways in which it can be both documentary and propositional. And I think there are subtle ways without kind of it needing to be a fiction within the film, or a kind of departure from documentary within the film, although that can be a way of doing it. I think what holds the film for me seems to be the potential.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I love thinking about both what Tanya and Kate are saying, that one might develop an architectural practice inside the film, that you might be a dual agent, therefore, that you could use film as the agency to deliver some of the work, but it might, in the future, you might be developing a kind of an architectural practice to do with occupying what Tanya was talking about, the other side of the coin. And I wonder if there maybe this is just another mode of delivery that the work could chase amongst many. But I love thinking about, you know, setting up the film apparatus and the cinema, and then the practice actually leverages that infrastructure to produce values and so on, but also implicates the high rise, the shiny, you know, the multiplying things as part of the, not as an antagonist, but somehow not preaching to the choir, somehow tries to implicate, and not as other, but brings those into the equation. And
yeah, I think the film, the process of me documenting and doing it really opens up the questions of the process of designing, the planning at different scales. And I think at this moment, I really sort of tend to reflect on what is the process of designing, and what are we trying to look at it from what angles? How do we frame the views we show the client? And even to this specific site, how even just look at how the people got displaced into the modern flats, how do they adapt? And that really helped me to understand what to design, what do they need, and as a community, as a specific one, rather a general one.
Fantastic. Just aware of time again, I think perhaps we if there are any more comments or any questions from you, AJ, for the panel. We're going to follow this by a discussion, and I'd open it up to anyone watching to write any questions into the chat, and I will bring them up, and they can be questions for the students, comments on the students' projects, or questions for the critics. Do type those in. Yeah, I mean, AJ, I think there's a real potential to think about the agency of this film, and if it's it could be a film for architects. You know, I think that it has a power in some way, and if for me, you need to identify the kind of agency of it in order for it to find a place in the world, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Just as a kind of general, I think while we see if anyone's going to write any comments. I mean, I think I'm going to just make a few comments overall about all the projects, and I've thoroughly enjoyed this morning. I think it's been such a lovely range of projects, such a great discussion. I think it really highlights given the topic, the site, I think the kind of complexity of the fabric of a site perhaps leads us to thinking about an architecture of processes, not objects, an architecture of, you might say the software, not the hardware necessarily, and that the kind of the physical matter is always contingent on the flow and this kind of sea of social, political, technological factors. And I think when we think about site, it's that mesh, it's that fabric, that thickness that becomes a really interesting space, not just a kind of physical vantage point or a plot of land, of procedures, legislation, protocol, and then of kind of media, so of mediation, how we're seeing, how we're viewing, and what we're viewing through, I think is also really critical probably to all of you. You're looking at this site through something always, especially now. There's a point of view, there's a point of persuasion, there's a sense of collaboration and community, and I think all the projects which really came across an idea of trying to understand a series of connections. And I think just one thing Perry brought up, which I think is really critical maybe to all of you, is this structural or is this a specific project? Can this project be an example of something bigger, or does it always have to sit within the bounds of its own logic? I think that's a question probably. Perhaps I throw it open to the critics for a wonderful panel for any kind of general comments. I don't see any questions yet from the Zoom people.
I didn't realise there were 91 people with us. I thought it was just us. That was a real shock.
It's quite good that in a way. I quite like it.
There were more even, but then I started talking. Kate, I think you're. Oh, sorry, Danny, did you want to go? No, I'll be really brief then. Yeah, I think, Kate, your summary was really, really good. I think those are kind of exactly the key themes that we need to be engaging with as well. And I sort of like where and very rightly so, say structure as one sort of a like takeaway possibility. I also think of that as method. In other words, what is transportable from this as a way of thinking as well. And there's something about that where we ended up as well in terms of what is the specificity of this work, but also does it sit into a series of things that might happen? So does it become a program in terms of whether it's a cinematic, whether it's architectural? So there's a lot there that in terms of exactly like what are the instruments through which site becomes multiplied and thus taken away, not necessarily in a negative sense at all, but also as a sort of a, whether it's epistemological in terms of knowledge, or whether it's aesthetic, or how these things fuse. Yeah, there's a lot there. These have been super, rich presentations. Tania.
I suppose I was it's not fully formed, this thought, as you will find out in a minute, but in relation to site, I thought some really interesting questions around ownership, collective ownership, ownership of truth, ownership of archive, and then just seeing how all presentations were trying to take ownership of their subject as well. And again, this relates to this idea of if you're setting up a model that could be shared with others. So to fully claim your ownership then means you can enable it to be shareable. And I think there's some sort of mirroring going on with how you're talking about place, and then what you're doing with that. Yeah, I'm not sure how well I've kind of explained that, but so I mean, you talk about site, you talk about land. The question of ownership is very real and very complex, and how you then engage with it and who owns this place ultimately. And how that sits in the timeline of these places as well, because others have owned it before and others will own it in the future. So I suppose there's some very interesting questions about time came up today in relation to site, and how every site is a pamphlet, overwritten and overwritten and overwritten, and just how your individual kind of writings on that site are really interesting and very provocative. Yeah, so just to say, really enjoyed it overall.
Yeah, just quickly, a couple of things. First, Kate, thank you very much for the invitation and to meet Jussi and Tanya and the students for doing the work. It's been, I'm up early, but I don't mind getting up 5 o'clock, so there are a couple of things that occur to me. Again, really enjoyed the conversations. It seems important for all of the students maybe to understand what the scope of the work is, what it really is interested in discussing, what its responsibilities are. And I would probably, given the range of political environments and charged deep sites and so on, would really try to work out what are the 3 or 4 key things that I want the work to deliver. So scope would be scope. What's in the Roman Catholic Church does a different body of work than a corner mom and pop store. Of course, I need to maybe mention, all of us maybe, the roles of representation. So I know I know there's not a tremendous amount of time left, but I would look at the politics of representation in terms of how you're actually working on the work, because I think there are loaded backgrounds there that would help contribute to how you actually frame the particular interests that you have. So for example, aerial perspectives or pictorial renditions of something have a particular register in terms of what they can deliver and how they deliver those things, and to do with their cultural and historical and discursive background. So I would really think about the roles and capacities of representation. And maybe lastly, I like thinking about the tools at our disposal as, let's say, architects to contribute generously to a world. And I might try to identify within the range of programmatic logics and representational techniques and ways of working and histories that we could leverage. I might be at the moment, take a moment to reflect on what are those tools that we have to speak disciplinarily, and then what are the ones that I need to invent tools. I don't mean software and triangles and so on, but what are the things that we can leverage or enroll to speak about what we want to speak about? And that would help, I think, sharpen some of the approaches that are in play. Which do I want to leverage programmatic thinking, and where has that been leveraged, for example, in the history of architecture to higher effect, to move from structural thinking through specifics and so on? I would say, well, what are my allies? What are my key allies with respect to the work that I'm trying to do historically, but also inventively, in terms of maybe the discipline hasn't been there before, and you need to invent the equipment, the gear, the provisions to deliver the messages that you have in mind. I like the work, enjoyed a lot. So yeah.
I just wanted to say, Perry, it's been really lovely watching it get light behind you. The
sun will come up at some point.
At some point. And I have a question that's been bugging me for about a year since life switched to this, and this is a conversation about sight, and it's where are we right now? You know, we're talking from all these different places, and we're making references to other places, and we're all in our own space, but I don't know where I am right now in this conversation. I don't know what this is called. I don't know what this site is called. Zoom World doesn't really cover it for me, but it is a kind of reality and a space and a site that we have occupied collectively now for nearly a year. Well, yeah, about a year. And I'm still questioning what that is and how does that impact on all these projects, all this work that we're doing at the moment and as we move forward. And I thought someone in this group of nearly 100 people might have an answer for me. So there's a question. While I'm in your very learned company, I just thought I'd throw that one out there.
If anyone has an answer to this question, there are some things in the chat I just wanted to quickly read out. Does AJ know the work of Japanese activist collective Agawa Productions? I think it's kind of an open question. No, so he's going to have a look in a minute. Yeah. And we've got something from Sasha. Is the site study able to help to identify the specific need in the project? Is the cinema what is needed? That's a good question. I think that's to you, AJ. And if the film and the process of making the film, especially one about one's own place, family, what is the role of objective looking versus subjective looking? I think I'm reading that right. Yeah. Sasha, if I'm butchering your question, you can butt in.
So I guess if we look at all the 4 projects, we all sort of use the media of a video or moving pictures, and I think there is a powerful tool nowadays, especially in this time, for researchers and projects. And to answer your question specifically about the cinema, I think as for my project or for our unit, the documentary films, or how we call it, the sensitive observer, is trying to look at the things, the process of before a project, and that leads to questions of what are we studying, and what are the things can give us the ability to draw conclusions for a design project. That also talks about the sort of the question of subjectivity and objectivity, which in my film I try to the ways I try to document, and even the position of my camera is trying to stay at a degree where I can stay true to what happens. And I try to keep that for when I'm editing, and also color grading and these details. I think there is I think as a project, the film has this kind of layers of information and techniques which construct a better or overall project that is very similar to what an architectural project is.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think that what would be nice is to think, the film not just a tool for architects and us sitting at a distance looking into a context, but a film to be re-embedded in its own context and generate discussion and conversation from within. I think that it has that's what I kind of meant about agency, like who's the film for, and what's its site. I think, and there was a question from Chapman. The study of displacement reminds me of a film called Still Life by Jia, you're going to have to correct my pronunciation, Zhangqi. I personally went, sorry?
贾樟柯.
Yeah, no, I didn't do anything like it was supposed to be there. Apologies. I personally went to explore the areas in China to interview people who had been displaced. It's really interesting how some particular individuals actually pointed out areas within the gorges where they used to live and work. There seems to be both sides of the coin, whereby many have embarked into a new way of life, new careers, and it seems to be positive and negative. I remember one of the displaced individuals mentioned a ridiculous small amount of money given to them per square foot of land that they owned. Interesting. What effect do these displacements have populations years on for people who now have access to these displaced land? It seems so complex. I don't know if you want to comment on that, AJ.
Maybe just a few words. So there are a lot of displacement or land requisition from the government. There are a lot of different types of land requisition. So my own one, as what I showed in the presentation, is the land came from the system of people's commune, and that was the beginning of China in the 50s and the 60s. And this part of this system is the land, for example, is owned by the people. So once the displacement happened, when the ownership changes, this would mean the government would give back to all the people money for exchange, and also and that's a kind of different from if you have housing blocks that was built after the economic reform in the 80s. That would be a kind of different story because that wasn't in the commune system. But I think your question is about this kind of two sides of coin problem. I think from a project, it's really about it is about that. It is about the question of how much we can do, or as an architect, and in building a physical space that can help people to adapt to these situations where it comes from a much higher level. I think there is a limitation. I think there is also a reflection for when I was filming the people, in order to understand like what kind of architect and what kind of process of designing I should take.
Thank you. I think that's really a nice comment to end on, and perhaps it points to who we decide is the client for our work, right? Or the benefactor, the beneficiary, sorry. And I think we'll probably draw it to a close. There aren't any other questions in the chat. I wanted to say, I mean, just as a response to Tanya's question about where are we, it's a comment rather than an answer, but I find this space that actually, when we're in a space together, our vision, we're in the same space, right? But in this space, all our kind of foveal vision, our center vision is in the same space, is in the same kind of consciousness, but all our peripheral visions are in different spaces around the world. And I think that to me is quite interesting, that outside of this box, my world is completely different. And actually my peripheral hearing, where I can hear my children downstairs, is, you know, we have a kind of multiplicity of peripheral visions going on, even though we're all supposed to be kind of centrally in the same space, focus wise. And I think that means we are kind of slightly distracted, constantly slightly distracted by things that other people aren't distracted by, maybe. I think, unless anyone's got any other burning comments, I think we'll pull the drawstring, pull it to a close. Thank you so much. Thank you to the students. I thought you all presented beautifully today, and I would say that think about the form of the project. I think from here on in, it's like you've got kind of content on the roll. I think how you forcefully present and how you choose what media, what vantage points, what type of imagery the form is really important. Thank you to the critics. You guys have been amazing, but I kind of knew you would be when you all ended up being together. Thank you, Tanya, Yussi, Perry, especially Perry, because it's so early, and maybe the sun will come up over there at some point. Right, I think we're going to go and break for lunch then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's been really great. Thanks very much.
And Happy New Year as well.